Hi, everybody, and welcome back to the HCD Mindset vidcast series on YouTube during our season 2, where we're doing a lot more interviews. And we would like to welcome Sean to the vidcast. So this should be really fun. We're going to talk a bit about his background. We've been doing some work with him lately, getting to know him a little bit better. So he's going to tell himself a little bit about himself to everybody. But before we launch into that, as normal, we're going to do a little bit of background on ourselves as well. For those of you that are new to the vidcast, my name is Michelle Niedziela, and I'm VP of Research and Innovation at HCD. Always joined by Kathryn. Kathryn?
Hi, everybody. Yep, Kathryn Ambroze here, Manager of Behavioral and Marketing Sciences. I've had the pleasure of actually meeting Sean this year in the UK. We did some work together, and as soon as I met him, I was like, I have to get him on the vidcast. So I'm happy we were able to make this work and schedule it. With the time zone differences, this is the great thing about everyone being familiar with Zoom now. But without further ado, I'll let Michelle share a little bit about HCD, and then we'll find out more about Sean.
So again, just briefly for those of you that are new to the series or new to learning about HCD, we are a market research consulting provider, and we use a holistic approach to understanding the consumer experience. So perceiving, evaluating, responding to different types of stimuli, consumer products, and consumer communications. We use the most innovative and effective research tools that really range from applied consumer neuroscience, as well as through qual and quant traditional research methods. And we explore all sorts of aspects of the human experience, from the early stages of exploration of research, all the way through the end stages of validation of both product development, all the way through marketing. Our work can be done anywhere in the world, which is kind of what we're going to talk about here a little bit, because we've done some of that work with Sean. But it can be done online or in person, with any sort of labs or, whatever it is that is most appropriate for the research question. So without further ado, let's launch right into exactly who you are and what you do. So welcome, Sean. Let's get a little bit of overview of, what it is. What's your background?
My background's quite varied, actually. So study forensic science at university, traditional wet lab style. When I left, didn't go into it at all, kind of stumbled into doing some charity work, did some sort of fundraising and marketing team from there for a couple of years, and then moved into doing a bit of consultancy, teaching people how to use some software. And that was more about satisfaction surveys for local council and our NHS service. And in that time, I was kind of curious about lots of things, and did some study around teaching, study around first aid and sports therapy and all the bits and pieces. And then finally sort of came towards my current career, stumbled into the role of a psychology technician. My friend needed some help for a period of time, filling in the blanks where he'd left staff, and I kind of took that job on for a 6-month period. Sort of in 7 years later, fast forward, kind of moved into my current role of head of sort of the laboratory at LSE. So in that time, because I didn't have a psychology or kind of human science research background, I did my master's in research methods and psychology to kind of fill that gap. But yeah, just over the years, I've just kind of taken opportunities as they come. I'm quite curious by nature, which I think lends itself to my current role, kind of finding stuff that interests me, figuring out how to make it better, that kind of thing. That kind of helped. But yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell, really.
Yeah, it seems like it all kind of relates, though, to troubleshooting in a way, because even from, the foundational work that you were doing, what you originally went to school for, forensic science, it's still piecing together parts of things and trying to figure out, what happens, but also you're really trying to answer a research question in forensic science too. It's just a different application of it. So there is this kind of common theme throughout your career trajectory, even though it's not, what everyone does. I can't say I have any background in forensics, or sports medicine or anything like that.
So what kind of scientist would you describe yourself as being? If you had to give somebody sort of like are you a behavioral scientist, a psychological researcher? I know sometimes we use behavioral neuroscientists. What kind of descriptor do you think at least fits you at the moment, right? Because I think it changes over time.
Yeah, I think if you asked me 18 months ago, like when I was still in my new role, I'd say psychologist, like psychology researcher, because that's my old job was core psychology. But now, I don't know, if I'm honest, psychology and human behavior have such an overlap that I think, depending on my hat in that day, but I'd say probably sort of a research in human sciences probably is the best way to describe it.
Yeah.
Tapping into both worlds.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it really helps to have that varied background as well, right? Because I think when you come into any sort of human research, humans are complicated.
Yeah, to say the least.
And so it really helps to have that varied background to better design, I think, when you're talking about research methods and things like that. I think so much of what we do is really design on the fly, right? So it's very customized, and you have to think about, okay, what's this group of people? What's this research question? What's this product? What's this stimuli? Whatever it might be.
Mm-hmm.
So how did we meet you?
So I think you guys were doing some research in the UK, and I think COVID complicated things for yourselves, and you kind of reached out to try and find some support. I answered the call, and we kind of just got chatting from there. Really, it was just it seemed like an interesting opportunity because just the project we'd done, I taught a little bit on that before, but I'd never actually done any real research in that area. So I knew the equipment, I knew the setup, but actually to get my teeth into collecting data, using it, seemed like quite an exciting opportunity, and it just evolved from there, really.
Right, and you have a lot
now.
of experience using BioPack as well, which is something that we use frequently when we're in the field. So that was also one of the things that kind of connected us together. And your background also in just understanding research methodologies really came to help us during this interesting year that we've had.
And that's certainly been
Can you tell a little bit
invaluable.
about your role that you had? Because you do dabble a little bit in both academia and in industry. So how do you feel like those connect well? Or it seems like what we have written here, you really are a nice little hybrid of both.
Yeah, that's kind of quite a layered question. I think that they can work well together, and they can clash quite a lot as well. And I think it just depends on a few factors. People being the biggest one. As I say, humans are complicated. So I think this idea of the people's idea of what academia is and who academics are versus what the corporate world or kind of outside of academia can be. And I think if you go with those preconceptions, then it can be quite tricky to maneuver. So I'd say for me, they can work well together, and there are lots of similarities. It's just slightly different approaches. So for example, this idea of funding projects, how do you get funding for a project? It'll be the same in both worlds, really, right? You always kind of hunting for that funding to get the questions answered that you need to. I think just in academia, and that kind of links into the idea of pace, it can be a bit slower securing that funding because there's more rigor in where that funding's coming from, how it can be spent, how it can be allocated, and then that kind of integrity aspect that universities kind of check, which it does exist in that kind of outside of academia as well, absolutely. But I think in universities there's a lot more kind of caution around how they're going to acquire their funding and spend it.
In your university setting, I know when I was coming through my graduate program, and we would have journal club meetings, and we would talk about research, and often people would make comments about where the funding came from, right? And if it was from industry or it involved researchers that were in industry, then often in this academic group, they would dismiss the research. They say, oh, well, it must be, it had a purpose, right? And, then when I moved into industry, I had, that my head was kind of filled with this just bias.
Stigma almost.
Yeah. And, but I learned really quickly that in industry, it's really damaging to do bad research, right? And so while we were kind of taught that like industry might try to, shortcut research or try to bias research in their favor, one thing I found working, at Johnson & Johnson and at Mars Chocolate was that, wow, if they messed up any research, it's millions and millions of dollars at stake.
Crazy.
And which is maybe more incentive to do it right than, in academia, where it's publish or perish.
Yeah.
And, you kind of have more pressure to publish things that might, not be exactly right. And so like, it was just kind of eye-opening to me to see the stigma that was in academia versus, in industry. And industry has a different stigma about academia, where they kind of look at it as kind of like stodgy or kind of like inflexible or time consuming. They don't get things done very quickly, type of thing. What are your thoughts on both of those sort of views, the biases on each side?
Yeah, I think, like you say, the kind of publish or perish thing is a big factor. And that has lent to people, like you say, publishing things that maybe could be a bit more rigorously tested. And especially in the human sciences, there's that whole replication issue around the design factors and
p fishing and
Yeah, exactly. So I think that there's integrity on both sides, right? And I think sometimes it comes down to the individual group or the individual researcher from there. I think there is a change though, like with the way we're capturing data and the amount of data out there now. I think people are slowly realizing that actually there is integrity and consequences on both sides if you do get it wrong, or if you do mislead your investors, your stakeholders, the general public, however it might be. I think the other thing about sort of what I found in sort of the corporate world or the non-academic world is that sometimes they see academic research as a bit fancy. There's no real application. Where are you going with this? It's just you have time to think around ideas. Exactly. Inflate your own ego, if you will, kind of, But again, I think with the tightening funding issues and actually the amount of research out there now, people in that world are having to prove their worth and the value of the research they're doing and what is it leading towards from there through. So I think with that in tow, institutions are working with organizations more and more. And actually, it's also for the private organizations or the kind of corporations, they are working with academics a bit more as well, because they can then borrow some of that perceived integrity that maybe they don't have as well. So that independent review, if you will. So I think we are moving in the right direction. But it's one of those strange ones where on an individual level or on a smaller group level, you talk to people and everyone's on the same page and everyone realizes there's a lot of stigma. But as you go up and more people get involved, that kind of gets lost in there. And I think the old kind of caps come back into play.
It's interesting you say that, because the other thing that I think is so important to bring up here is that, really great research is done in industry and academia, and really bad research is done in industry and academia.
Absolutely.
So it's kind of one of those things that even if something comes from a really prestigious institution, it can't hide behind a name if the data wasn't collected well, or if there was p-hacking that occurred. There's all these little things that it's important to keep a critical eye always, regardless of where it came from. There's just it's the potential is always there. There's always some type of a risk in bad research or not even acknowledging limitations. Things like that are
We've certainly seen quite a bit of sort of retractions going on, and even in kind of our area when it comes from the academic side. But unfortunately, you don't get retractions when it comes to the industry side, because they don't always publish these things, right? And we've definitely seen that problem where really big names, kind of like we're talking about the issue of like a very popular and trusted institute of education doing a major retraction, gets a lot of press in that and people understand. But I think when it comes to, let's say, a large organization that has been talking about a methodology they've been doing that turns out to be faulty, nothing really ever comes of that. And I think that's a real problem in the whole neuromarketing thing, right? Where there isn't a lot of accountability for any sort of snake oil salesmanship that happens. Outside of some companies go out of business, they go away, but I don't think that's always because of their false promises, but usually because they're just smaller. I think like the really big giants, when they there's not a lot of accountability for them to have to do things right all the time. Have you seen anything like that?
Not firsthand. I mean, I have seen and hear of it through the kind of grapevine. But like you say, for the bigger organizations, they don't have to publish, they don't have to open up their methodologies and the type of work they're doing. So if something does go awry, like say it doesn't really make it out into the mainstream, kind of just, you might hear things through the grapevine, but normally there's no real kind of consequence to that organization. They might lose that client, but then the clients that's normally working with them equally don't want to push that out there because that might tarnish their reputation as well. So there's a lot invested, I think. So yeah, I think it does happen, but it doesn't come across my door that often anymore. I think either we're getting better, or they're getting better at kind of keeping it behind closed doors and moving on.
I think there's, again, hiding behind their own proprietary algorithms to some degree. But I do have a hope that it has been getting better for sure. I think, the client, the customer is becoming more savvy in a lot of ways, right? They're asking more questions and
Absolutely. And I'm curious from your perspective, because you do work with students in a master's program, what are the opportunities that they have to explore industry? Because that's something of interest to me, because when I was in undergrad, it was never really discussed as an option to do science in an industry setting.
Same for me in a PhD program. I never knew that you could do this.
Right. It was always, you want to be a neuroscience major. All right, you're a pre-med track. That was kind of just the assumption automatically. So how did you kind of break that down and offer these opportunities now for them to see industry?
It's interesting because actually my current institution, LSE, have been talking a lot about this lately, about the careers that people can go into. So for example, our undergrad is psychology and behavioural science. And in the UK, certainly our psychology programs are typically accredited by a professional body. And they have, prescribed, you could go into cognitive psychology, you could go into clinical psychology. But when you start talking about the behavioral science aspect, everyone's like, well, what actually can I do and where can I go? And actually, our institution, what we try to do is talk to a lot of alumni that have gone out into the world. So who are working as executives for different companies. So we've got a lot of behavioral economics interested students, we've got a lot of kind of marketing interested, and we're tapping into them, seeing if they can go and do placements or just reach out and speak to those execs and go, how did you stumble across this and how would I get into their area? But I think it is a problem in the psychology behavioral science, especially in the UK, about, well, what am I qualified to do when I leave? And this kind of thing isn't really pushed that much, actually. It's still that academic route or that kind of academic research or teaching. Yeah.
So a lot of the work you do has to do with like building labs, right? Tell us a little bit about that.
Okay, so I think one of the things that interested me about the job I took on at LSE was they were building a brand new lab, and the idea of being there from the beginning was really, really interesting and quite enticing, because that idea of like, whenever you work in a role, it's like you kind of go, if only we had this set up, or why didn't they see this? And so there's a chance to kind of, put my money where my mouth is, I guess, really. Building the lab, it was, there's lots of things I expected and lots of unexpected. So obviously, anytime building a lab, things you've got to look at are like, well, what research are we going to be doing? And actually, how do we future-proof our lab to a certain extent, particularly in human sciences? It's constantly evolving, especially in the last 5-10 years. And then with that, the big one is, well, how much money do we have to meet those needs? And particularly in my lab, it's like, well, we are going to be doing academic postgraduate research. We are looking to do kind of corporate research, getting other partners in. But a big part of it is also training students and getting them involved and building them up. So those are all the factors we had around it. And so when I arrived, I was given a wish list of this is the kit that we'd really like to see. And then sort of unpicking, well, what are you actually going to do with that? Because I think we all get carried away with this idea of you see some cool research and you see this cool equipment and you want it. How are you going to apply that to your work? Like, is it going to answer the questions you think it's going to answer? So for us, it was that idea of, well, what is it we need? And we need to cover a broad spectrum of research. We need to cover the cognitive kind of domain. We want to go into a bit into neuro, and we need the tools that we can train students all the way up for. So lots of negotiations with our states, with our IT infrastructure, like, can this kit work for us? And then we got to the point of actually, well, we know what we want. And for us, it was things like eye tracking and EEG and BioPack and those tools. So then it was a case of, well, where are we going to get these from? Which vendors and who do we talk to and how do we kind of get that going? And some of it was easy. I mentioned BioPack, kind of. They're a complete package.
Pretty easy to work with, yeah.
They're quite easy to work with, and and actually they're quite university standard and industry standard. So there was a nice crossover there. Others, it was kind of feeling out, well, what's going to work, what's going to be the best medium for both worlds. So there's some great packages out there that are good. They do everything for you. I've spoken to Kathryn about this before. For students, I'm not always so keen on that, actually, because I want them to learn what's underneath that bonnet and be able to break things and put them back together, because
go under the hood of the car and really
exactly
what's happening.
Because then it goes back to our question of, like, well, you can then, when you're talking about your findings, you can be confident in your data. You go, actually, we've kind of broken this down, we've looked at it, we checked it all, the variables are correct. And then equally as well, like, if we have all the bells and whistles in our kit and you go out into the working world, every chance you may not have that, and you might have older versions. And so, we have to
totally. But also, your ability to switch versions, right? So even brands or whatever it might be. So let's say you grew up using BioPack. What if you end up working in a location that's using some other sort of device, right? But if you understand the basics, you can typically figure it out. And that's why when I used to teach research methods, I also taught a statistics portion of that. And I made everybody do everything by hand. So we did ANOVAs and t-tests by hand.
Must have loved you.
Oh yeah, I was well loved. But like a real issue there was really that, if you're just learning SPSS, or you're just learning R, or you're just learning SAS, you aren't getting the opportunity to, you're memorizing a program. You're not really learning much about the fundamentals of what you're comparing. So then if you switched over using Statistica or SAS, then you should still be able to figure out what your variables are, what's the appropriate test, things of that nature. When making your lab and making sure that it really included all the things that you needed, choosing the right vendors, keeping everything so that it was very learning focused so the students could really get something out of it. What challenge did you face in being able to accomplish all of that?
So keeping everything within budget was always the big one. Getting everything in place in time as well. So, for example, we had some observational suites with like pan-zoom cameras in there. There's a lot of work in the infrastructure and building that, and lots of different parties involved. So the external contractors, the vendors, and IT, and everyone working together and pulling it together. So getting everyone talking together was one of the big challenges, and making sure that we could meet what the vendors needed in order to get the kit up and running. And then the other one was just little things like making sure we had, so I mentioned future proofing. So we know that actually, even though we get the kit in today, it might be a year or 18 months before it's used. And actually, before we open it up, it'll be out of date. So the challenge was making sure that we got the right packages that could be updated or added on and upgraded. So one of the things that I negotiated with all the vendors, which was sort of non-negotiable for me, was actually we want 3 years, 5 years upgrades included for all software, particularly, and some hardware. I think that was the kind of the big challenge, is get everyone in the same room at the same time, making sure that this big investment would actually work, and that everything would talk to each other as it's meant to, because that's one of the big fears when you're bringing in new technology.
Of course, and it's very future facing. So, you can't really predict what's coming around the corner, such as, a pandemic or something like that.
Exactly.
It's,
you don't know
a little
when
bit.
that's going to happen.
Yeah. I think one other challenge was actually with all this new software and hardware, and it was actually, do we have the skills to use this? And what's the learning curve on this for me? Because obviously I'm going to have to support it, but also for the academics and the students, that they'll learn as they go, right? But yeah, I think that was the other one, is actually, will we be able to use it? Will I know how to use it? Will we learn in time? What's that kind of going to be like? So, but that's the fun part of the job, actually getting stuck in and seeing what it's all about, I think, as well. So
I feel like as technicians, you kind of love the grind a little bit, where you like the little bit of anxiety of what's about to happen around the bend. Like, how can we fix this? How can we problem solve on the fly? So
yeah.
I
think that's a really big part that I think that people don't really realize, is that it could be that, what if something goes wrong? What if a piece needs to be replaced? What if there's some sort of IT issue? You do have to sort of solve that on the fly, because when you do have participants coming in, and they're coming in like, like this.
Exactly, on a schedule.
Yeah, you have to keep it going somehow. And so being able to critically think through the problems and be prepared for them is just such a huge part, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think there's another piece that people forget about when they're building a lab and planning out budgeting, is some of this stuff is very subscription based, right? So you're paying by the month to have a service, or also just to have access to the customer services for troubleshooting. And, it's a piece that I think people forget quite a bit.
I think it's becoming more and more that way, actually. Especially now, sort of 10, 15 years ago, it was all about hardware.
Yeah.
Now it's all about the software, especially in things like eye tracking and VR, where it's constantly moving, and you could be out of date within 6 months sometimes. And actually that could be costly for you. You spent a lot of money and you can't quite do what you're expecting to be able to do. So yeah.
Expectations, right?
Yeah.
So, kind of speaking of challenges, we've all faced a pretty big challenge this past year with COVID-19. So, what do you see as some of these sort of effects that have happened on your work in all of your roles? Doing research, being an instructor. What sort of accommodations have been made? What have you had to do this past year?
So obviously the teaching side of it has been completely transformed. I think what it's done for universities in particular is accelerate this idea of online learning. Actually, it's going to be the norm, right? That you're not going to get students coming in for every single lecture anymore.
Yeah. Not going away. Yeah.
No, exactly. So it's that idea of how to balance that and still get the same level of teaching and still level of interaction. So, even post COVID-19, like we said, we'll probably still have some online element. And it might be that you do the big lectures online, and then we bring you in for the smaller seminars where you can interact and things like that. I think that's been a big impact. And obviously the costs involved in getting all that up and going as well. Teaching the research side of it has taken quite a beating, actually. Particularly in my lab, we've closed, and we're not open at the moment, and we're not going to be open for a little while longer. So how do we still get these skills? Because the students are still going to be there for those 3 years. They're not going to stick around longer just to get those up. So how do we kind of impart that knowledge across? And that kind of ties into how do people conduct research? Because initially everything just put everything on pause. Like we'll write it out for the first 3-6 months. We'll just take the hit. And then it became quite apparent that it's not going to be just 3-6 months. This could be a long, long time or ongoing. So again, we looked at potentially online resources, and there's quite a lot out there. Again, if you're doing questionnaires or surveys, there's some great tools out there already. But if you're looking for more kind of reaction-based tasks and things like that, that's where the challenges came in. So we spent a lot of time looking at possible solutions. And as it happened, we already had one. We use a software package called Gorilla, which is kind of an online experimental package, and CircuitPy is another one that we use. And with the involvement of HTML5, it meant that actually you can get precise timings now, so everything is there. We looked at that, so we started using that. We've used that as our teaching tool, and actually some students have gone on to do that and use that in their research, as well as some of the academics. So, you can have your reaction-based tasks, you can have your IATs, you can have your streaks done online. And then the challenge there is, well, we're not controlling the environment, right? We don't have as many controls. So how do you balance that? Well, we discussed this a lot about, well, you have less control, but actually your population is huge. You have to have that trade-off. So you might get 10 times the amount of participants, but you don't have that amount of control. And then that's where you come into being smart about how you might analyze that data and how you use that. So there's been lots of talks around, the pros and cons of online research. If you're doing experimental work, particularly questionnaires, people will answer how they answer. It doesn't really, the environment doesn't matter so much. But if you're doing reaction-based tasks, then, a distraction like a small child running in while you're trying to do the task, things like that can throw you. But actually, it's opened up a lot of conversation, and a lot of us are looking into, well, can you do eye tracking online? Can you do kind of other psychophys measurements online, like face reader, facial expressions? And, we all come to the conclusion that it's possible, but with a very, very large pinch of salt. Like how far you can stretch that is the question that we don't know yet, But I think what it's done is it's put a lot of people's mind into, well, actually, let's go into the big wide world of the web, and let's refine those tools quicker than we might have done,
Yeah, we've also seen some added, challenges when doing that as well, because there's certainly some people who, the first step to being able to do online research is someone agreeing that you can, say, record them in some way.
Yeah.
Right.
And you do lose a good amount of people who simply don't want their webcam on or don't want their activity recorded. And if you can't get past that, then that's a real problem. So of course you're going to lose a percentage of the population, but how different is that population from the one that would have come directly into a facility, right? Yeah. So it's a very, it's delicate, like you said. There's challenges you have to take into consideration.
Yeah, definitely are. But I'd say, I think there can be some good comes from it, because it started the conversations, and people are really sort of rigorously looking at, well, even this online data, how useful is it? Because if you're paying people just to rack up questionnaires, how much are they actually investing of themselves into that questionnaire? How deep are you going with those questions? How meaningful are the answers they're giving you? So I think that there's a lot there to unpick, but it's the way we're heading, and I think it's not going anywhere now. People have seen the
awareness, I would say, as well, as to what are the things that you should consider while you're going through this. What are different components, like making sure that the person has stable Wi-Fi, making sure that they're comfortable being on a camera. It's all these little things that they didn't have to be thought of when you're doing in-person research. And it's really reshaping the way that we approach the research design by having these, like we were saying with being a technician, having these future-facing ideas of the what ifs, like what if this situation was to happen? What if this was to happen? And in a way, it is helping us improve our research designs.
Yeah, I think it's like, say, when you're in the lab and something goes a bit awry, you don't expect the participant to fix it themselves. Whereas online, you're kind of relying on them to either hopefully follow some instructions or be tech savvy enough to understand that, oh, actually, I've got to change which speaker the sound's coming through and things like that, Yeah. But I mean, one of the things that I've worked with some of the academics is this idea of doing the best of both worlds. So potentially doing the large scale research and then mirroring it in the lab, and then seeing how much they actually overlap and translate, and can you extrapolate on a larger scale? And that's quite interesting. So do your eye tracking and your questionnaire data in the lab, and then expand that into the wide world and see, well, actually, how does it measure up? And that's quite an interesting kind of field to look into.
That's something that we do quite often. So, often our traditional forms of research, the qual and quant, our much larger sample, or at least not the qual, maybe the quant, is done, mainly online and might have a couple hundred people. And then we sort of take a percentage of that larger group. And, then it's only like 30 people that will do some sort of more in-depth measure. And then we do correlations between the two sets of data, right? So we want to have the same set of people who are doing the lab research to go through the same survey, right? To make sure that they are representative of the larger group. But that's kind of how we try to bring the story together as well, for sure. And it seems like that's might just be the way we'll consider doing this moving forward as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good thing, like you say, because we're always limited by the sample size we can get into the lab. But if we can kind of borrow some of those themes and borrow it out into the wider world, and obviously there's a bit of variance, and let's not overstretch our assumptions, but actually there's a trend here that's worth looking on that scale.
It could build an overall story that really helps better understand some sort of behavior or experience, for sure. And it was really interesting to work, be able to work with you, like you said, in these very kind of unique times, and bringing people in to do actual research, which, again, you're having to touch them, right? Which is like a strange thought these days, which is so kind of weird. Sometimes when I see people on TV, on a TV show, and they're all hanging out in a coffee shop, and it's like,
or going to a concert, you're like, ooh, so many people.
Yeah.
But, precautions can ultimately be taken, scanning people ahead, wearing the appropriate PPE and good filters, for air filtration, and just limitations. There's certainly limitations, but so we've all changed the way that we're working, and that all these things I think are going to be taken forward, right? Vaccines or not, there's a lot of scary things out there in the world. And I think, one of the things in seeing restaurants, for example, put out, their cleaning procedures for COVID, it's very much been, weren't you doing that already? It's like, we wash our hands. I hope so. And so I think a lot of these sort of precautions are things that we've always done. We've always, worn a lot of gloves and washed our hands and washed all the equipment. But, just being very vigilant about that, and taking a lot of these learnings and probably just having them as best practices, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, a lot of it's always been there. But it's made everyone aware now, participants as well as. So when we're doing some of the research, some of the participants was trying to clean down the kit after they'd finished using it as well. Automatically, you're like, I just got so used to doing that, and it's like it's good that everyone is aware of it now. So
it's kind of comforting, actually.
Yeah, it is good. Gives you hope, right? Gives you faith in humanity. Yeah, but
we all kind of need that right now.
Yeah.
Well, this has been very enjoyable, and I hope we can have you join again. I know that you're going to be talking with Kathryn more about some other sort of measures, but I would love to have you join us again as we continue to talk about all these issues and maybe some specific measures and applications. And so, thank you so much, Sean, for joining us, and thank you everybody for joining us, listening in on this. Please don't forget to subscribe. So click the subscribe button, make a comment below or a question if you have anything to say. You can also reach out to us. You can email us personally, visit our blog, tweet with us, go to our website. There's all sorts of ways to connect with us, LinkedIn, etc. And so I hope we get to see you all again on the next episode. But thank you so much for joining us today. Again, thank you, Sean, so much.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.